Hello, learners. I am Dr. Arunima Deka from OKD Institute of Social Change and Development, located in Guwahati, Assam. As you know, that this is a MOOC on economics of gender and development. And in the previous module, we have discussed three frameworks of gender analysis. That is the Harvard Analytical Framework, also known as the Gender Analysis Framework. Second, the Gender Planning Framework by Caroline Moser. Third, the Gender Analysis Metrics by Rani Parker. In today's module, we shall discuss Women Empowerment Framework developed by Sarah Longway and also the Social Relationship Approach developed by Naila Kabir. Both these frameworks that we discuss today strongly espouses for women empowerment. So, as we all know, that patriarchy and unequal power relations has always impeded women's equal participation in the development process. Gender discrimination is also deeply cultural. Achieving gender equality is being a key goal to make women part of the development process and debunk the myth of trickling down of benefits. One way of doing this is by making policy intervention. For this, we already discussed in the previous module, gender analysis is a key. Gender analysis highlights inequality in relationship between men and women by asking questions like who does what, who decides, who gains, and so. Without conducting a gender analysis, it is not possible to be certain that an intervention really can contribute to the promotion of gender equality. We often see in the literature of empowerment that the debate needs to consider that gender intersect with class, sexuality, nationality, and how overall economic policies impinge upon it. It is contextual, intersectional, and also location specific at times. Secondly, often there is a need for supportive leadership to be built who can take on the work of agents, individuals. Agents are individuals who can make change happen. Since the decade of 1980s, there has been a greater emphasis globally on women's participation in economy. There were discussions centered around women's access to resources, education, job, land, credit, asset, and so on. But this debate took an interesting turn, which could be read with the neoliberal policies adopted by many countries like India. It was here argued by many feminist economists like Naila Kabir, Narayan, Alkeri, and others that access to resources is not enough, but there is a need for enabling institutions also. And also, role women play in putting forth the demand for a better life, well being, that is, agency, more transformatory in nature, and the ability to make purposeful choices. By this time, it was found that the non market institutions greatly impacted women's economic position, economic development, and bargaining power within any given society. Deepa Narayan, for instance, in her work in 2005, states that empowerment is an expansion of the assets and capabilities of poor people to participate in, negotiate with, influence, control, and hold accountable institutions that affect their lives. Naila Kabir undertakes a feminist critique of the mainstream understanding of development process and proposes a bottom-up approach to women's empowerment. She defines empowerment as the process by which those who have been denied the ability to make strategies, life choices, acquire such an ability. Broadly, most literature on empowerment seems to draw into a consensus that there are three constitutive elements that are central. First of all, agency, second is resources, and third is the institutions. In this regard, indeed, that the capability approach makes the point that agency without resources are meaningless. Contrary to, and this is stated by many authors like Sabina Alkhairi, Ingrid Robbins, and others. Contrary, many economists also like Amartya Sen points out that women have to have access to resources, but they are constrained by the internalized oppression. Adding to this debate, many like Beena Agarwal says that it is key to have access to land, to institutional credit, as Naila Kabir points out, to education, as Shireen Jijiboy points out, labor market participation, and so on. Women, as these scholars writing over a decade concludes, that there are variety of tangible and intangible hindrances in the lives of women, in the way they make their life choices, well-being, and decision making. So there is a need for an institutional intervention in this. References to work of all these authors have been put at the end of the presentation. You can have a look at them. What we can draw from these debate is that gender inequality is also a multi-layered. It can't be deduced into one single cause and almost has a spiraling nature. Social norms, values, attitude, etc. also play a vital role in perpetuating inequalities in society. So gender inequality is hard to fix because power is gendered and linked to identities, our behaviors. It is also symbolic, and even institutions, you know, come to play a role, and therefore the need is for flexible strategies. For this, there is a greater demand for gender disaggregated indicators, baselines, and studies for gender analysis to make necessary program intervention. And it is in this reference that we talk of gender analysis framework. Okay, so the OECD in 2009, came up with a report, that is Social Institution and Gender Index synthesis report, made an attempt to capture, quantify, and measure some of the institutions that discriminate against women and girls through the Social Institution and Gender Index, that is the SIGI. Very broadly, it covers the dimensions like discriminatory family laws, that is age of marriage, restricted physical integrity, that is violence against women, female genital mutilation, son biases or son preferences, restriction of civil liberties, access to land, credit, restrictions to resources and entitlement, access to public spaces also. These combine affect women's decision making power, status, control over their bodies, access to and control of resources, participation in public places, voicing concern, and so on. So today, with the remaining two frameworks, we shall discuss, It is an attempt to see how gender analysis comes into the picture and into also in social research and planning and implementation which is proposing women's empowerment as a key component to achieve development. Okay, so first we start with Women Empowerment Framework. It was developed by Sarah Longway. She was a consultant of gender and development based in Zambia. In the 1980s, Women Empowerment Framework was designed to assess commitment to women empowerment and its impact on the community. Her framework is discussed in her work. You can also have a look at it. Gender awareness, the missing element in the Third World Development Project. It not only relates to women's participation but also control over processes and benefits. It is intended to help planners what women's empowerment and equality means in practice and how development interventions can support this agenda. She defines empowerment as enabling women to take equal place and participate in the development process and also to have control over factors of production. She argues for women's equality in development process rather than just on specific sectors like, for instance, education, employment, and so on. By development, Longway means enabling people to take care of their lives and escape poverty. Poverty, she further attributes, arises not from lack of productivity but from oppression and exploitation of women. Her framework is helpful to analyze the degree of commitment to women's equality and empowerment, first by identifying the levels of equality to be addressed by any intervention, and second by accessing the levels of recognition of women's issues as they exist in practical life. So now let us just look at these two tools of empowerment. Firstly, women's empowerment tool number 1, that is the level of equality, where she talks about the welfare level of women's material welfare relative to men. So as students of social science, you can also look into your own societies and understanding these concepts. Okay, so the second is access to factors of production. Third is conscientization. So what do we mean by this term? It is like developing critical awareness of our own socio-economic and political reality, and awareness that gender roles are cultural, and how one sees the sexual division of labor both within and outside the family. It calls for a transformation from being a passive object to active subject or an agent of change. And fourthly is participation, that is participation, decision making process, planning, and also in administration. Lastly, control. By control, she means women's control over decision making to gain access to control over other factors of production and also distribution of benefits. So the level of equality can be used to access any development intervention promoting equality and women's empowerment. Increased equality is indicative of increased empowerment. Going by this model, if intervention concentrates only on the welfare aspect, it is unlikely that women will find the project empowering in longer term. Secondly, we move on to the women's empowerment tool number 2, levels of recognition of women's issues, where Longway also states that it is not just important to assess the level of women's empowerment, but also identify the extent to which these project objectives are concerned with women's development, whether issues are ignored or recognized. She identifies three different levels of recognition of issues in any project design. Negative, that is, it has no mention of women's issues at all. Neutral, recognizes women issues but no specific actions are taken. Thirdly, is the positive, that positively concerned about women's issues and also attempts to improve them. So, women empowerment framework using both the tools 1 and 2 would somewhat look like as you can see it in the slide. This framework is useful for planning, monitoring, evaluation, allowing to see whether interventions can have a transformatory potential. Also, it tells us why empowerment is integral to the process of development and also has a strong political perspective for addressing women's inequality. One can, in case of India, for instance, look into the farmers producers organization using this framework. As young students of this course, maybe you can also attempt to look into your own society by using this framework for your research. But this framework comes under criticism, which we'll also discuss in the later part of this presentation, that it is concerned too much about women's empowerment without understanding how women and men relate in given social relationship, as it is found in any society. Also, the hierarchy of levels makes user think that employment is somewhat a linear process. So, coming to the second framework, we shall be talking about the social relation approach. This social relation approach was developed by Naila Kabir at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex. She developed this framework in collaboration with various policymakers, academicians, and also activists, mostly from the global south. So, now let us briefly discuss the SRA. The three key elements of this approach are the goal of development as human well-being. Secondly, the concept of social relation. Thirdly is institutional analysis. There are 5 concepts of social relation approach. The social relation approach concept number 1, it sees development as a process for increasing human well-being that includes survival, security, and autonomy, and not just of economic growth and productivity. The second concept is the social relation, according to Kabir, means structural relationship that create and reproduce systemic differences in positioning of different groups of people and determine their roles, rights, and responsibilities. According to Kabir, gender relation is also one type of social relation. So, like class, race, or ethnicity, they produce cross-cutting inequalities determining each individual's position in the structure and hierarchy of the society. But she also points out the social relation undergo change. They do undergo change. Now, moving on to the third concept is the social relationship approach. Concept number 3 is institutional analysis. Importantly, this framework recognizes the role of a range of institutions from macro to micro level, which are underlying causes of gender inequality. Institutions ensure production, reinforcement, and reproduction of social relations. 4 key interrelated institution realms: the state, market, community, and family. They produce, reinforce, and reproduce social differences and inequalities in their own ways. So you may have a look at the diagram in this slide where there are these key social institutions. For instance, the state. What is its organizational structural form? That is a legal, military, or the administrative organization. Official ideology and assumptions are that national welfare and interests are key. Then moving on to the key institution like market, what we see within this key institutional location are the firms, the financial corporations, the MNCs, etc. And what is their official ideology or assumption? It is about profit maximization. Thirdly is the community. It could be village council, informal networks, some sort of patron-client relationship, or even NGOs, and they are mostly geared to providing services. Fourthly is the kin family or the kinship, household, extended families, lineage groupings. For instance, in case of India, there is this panchayats and all. And what is their key ideology or assumption, it is about altruism. It is not conflictual, rather it is cooperative. So how well we, of course we all can criticize these institutions in own different ways, and that is what Kabir wants us to engage with. Okay, so again Kabir further states that all institutions differ and vary across culture, but are intrinsically there are five key dimensions of social of it. Firstly, rules, they govern the institutional behavior. Secondly, resources, people, activities, and so, for examining institutions on the basis of these dimensions is to understand how things get done, what is done, who will benefit, who gets what resources are produced, used, and distributed, how selection of people is done on the basis of class, gender, or other social inequalities, and who decides and whose interests are served, and so on. So, moving on to the social relationship approach, concept number 4, there is Kabir talking about the institutional gender policies. Through the framework, Kabir further classifies policies into three types, that is, depending on the extent to which they are recognized or they tend to address gender issues. Firstly, the gender blind policies, which she states that are implicitly male biased. Then there is the gender aware policies, and which is further divided into three policy types, that is gender neutral policies, where distribution of resources and responsibility mainly remains unchanged, gender specific policies, and gender redistributive policies, which is very key here, is they intend to transform existing distribution of resources and responsibilities to create a more gender balanced relationship. Okay, so moving on to the concept number 5, we see that this is something that talks about immediate, underlying, and structural causes, that identifies the cause of the problem and their effects on various actors. The framework has been used to analyze poor in relation to the credit excess in India, and her paper co-authored with Ramaya Subramaniam in 1996. The paper is titled Institution Relations and Outcomes, Concepts and Methods for Training in Gender Aware Planning. So you can refer to this paper. So the SRA sees development as primarily about increasing human well-being and not simply about economic productivity. Development interventions, therefore, must be assessed not only in terms of technical efficiency but also how well they contribute to the goal of survival, security, and dignity. It was also seen that the method of analyzing existing gender inequalities in distribution of resources, responsibility, and power, thereby this framework attempts to look into these three aspects of distribution of resources, responsibilities, and power, and thereby it attempts to enable women to be their agents, to be the own agents of development. Okay, so let us discuss some of the merits and limitation of both these two approaches. Firstly, the women empowerment framework of Longway, which its merits are it moves beyond practical and strategic need, as all was already given by Moser, which we have discussed in our previous module. But this model, this framework shows a potential to empower. Then, secondly, shows why empowerment is intrinsic to the development process, but it has certain limitations, like doesn't take into account how situation changes over time, sees women more as a homogeneous group. But it has its usefulness also in being transformatory model for planning, monitoring, and even implementation, and for training on empowerment. The social relation approach, on the other hand, gives a more holistic analysis of poverty, places gender at the center of policies, gives insight into the roots of subordination of women, and shows how institutions can bring about a change. But on the negative side, more emphasis on the structures. The concepts are too complicated to translate in the field at times, and there are certain overlaps between the institutions. For instance, the institution of community, the family, the state, and the market, where we often see that there are certain overlaps in these institutions, which watertight compartmentalization might not be possible in certain given contexts. Okay, but it is very efficient for project planning and policy development, for sensitization and training, and highlights women's productive and reproductive roles and how these can also be accounted for within the larger development process. Okay. So before we conclude, we would just like to just state that these frameworks are, some ways of discussing, number of factors that might come up in your research. And each framework, actually there is an attempt to discuss the set of values and assumptions framed by any respective authors, or even if you're using it in the field. So using any particular framework for your research actually depends on a number of factors. For instance, the purpose you're trying to achieve, and for the policymakers, if they are to make interventions in the field, these frameworks help in gender analysis, giving an analysis of the practical realities of the field as they are. Okay, so all these frameworks also find ways to address culturally embedded gender inequalities and suggest ways and means for making meaningful interventions through policies, programs, and so on. So, you can find the references used for this lecture at the end of the PPT for your use. And I suggest all of you go through this literature, the references, and make best of use of it. Thank you.